Some Hollywood stars leave behind more than just movies. Even after the curtain falls, the secrets, battles, and stories they leave behind don't go away. The world was shocked when Robert Redford died, but the whispers that followed were louder than the honors. Behind the smooth smile and perfect looks was a man with unforgiving grudges, broken friendships, and fights that shaped his whole career. There is one name that stands out, a star with so much power and fame that he would probably not pay his respects to Redford. What could have kept these two Hollywood giants so far apart, right up until the end? The last days of Robert Redford. When the sad news of Robert Redford's death spread on September 16, 2025, it made people in Hollywood and beyond think. People all over the world took a moment to remember a guy who had been a major figure in American movies for more than 60 years. Redford was one of the few stars whose work was mostly about the characters, and not just the fame. He had made movies that people wanted to see, won an Oscar for his direction, and started the Sundance Institute, which changed the way independent films were made forever. As the tributes came in, though, many people couldn't help but think about how quiet his last years had been, and how he had slowly faded from view before he died. When Redford finally talked about retiring in 2018, that was the turning point. For years, he had given hints that he might stop acting, but in an interview to promote The Old Man and the Gun, he said for sure that the movie would be the last one. He played an old bank robber in the movie who couldn't stop following his passion, even though it was getting late in life. It turned out to be a very good metaphor for his own journey. At the time, Redford told the Associated Press, "I think that since I'm getting older, it might be time to move toward retirement and spend more time with my wife and family." Even after making the news, Redford couldn't leave the business without one last role. He came back for an appearance in Avengers Endgame in 2019 as Alexander Pierce, a character he had created in Captain America, the Winter Soldier. The appearance was short, but it was important. Many people were shocked when Redford decided to join the Marvel franchise. He had built his career on tough dramas and stories that focused on the characters. Still, he said that he wanted to try out the new tools and technologies that are being used to make hit movies. In fact, the Russo brothers, who directed Endgame, later said that Redford told them that day that he would never act again. That short scene became a sign of the end of an amazing film career. After that, Redford turned his attention even less to Hollywood in the years that followed. He sold his horse ranch in Utah in 2020. He had owned it for many years. He was able to focus on his home in Provo Canyon and his land in Sundance after the sale. These were two important parts of his identity outside of acting. Utah was more to him than just a place to live. It was there that he made Sundance a cultural institution that has offered many filmmakers their first chances. Robert's last years were spent at a slower pace, with family and nature close by. Art, drawing, and protecting the environment were things he had always been interested in, and they took up a lot of his time. He enjoyed quiet days with his wife, Sybil Zaggers, and stayed close to his kids and grandkids in a place where art and nature were more important than fame or Hollywood. Redford was still interested in stories even after he stopped playing lead parts. He kept working behind the scenes as a director, and in the 2022 premiere of the AMC show Dark Winds, he had a big role. In 2025, he had a small role in the second season of the show. It was a quiet part that was important because it was so rare. That turned out to be his last show. He had a life that he had planned out all the way through. He died peacefully at his home in Sundance. The accolades that came after showed how influential he was to many people. Fans remembered the unforgettable figures he brought to life. And actors, directors, and producers all said Sundance helped them get their start in the business. Even though Redford got a lot of praise, his death brought to light his controversial image, which had caused a lot of trouble in Hollywood. Redford worked with many of the biggest names in the business, but he also had disagreements with some of them. These disagreements have led to rumors about who might or might not be at his funeral. It may have seemed like Redford's last years were quiet, but he had always been going through very hard times in his life. Before everyone praised him as a movie star, he had to deal with illness, loss, and sadness. He had experiences that affected the decisions he made in public and behind closed doors. A life full of fights. As a kid, Robert Redford had a mild case of polio, which scared parents all over America at the time. This was the start of his problems. Even though his condition wasn't as bad as many others, and he finally got better, he had to deal with being weak at a young age. It also made him feel more vulnerable than most kids his age ever do. He learned early on how quickly his health and security could disappear. This knowledge would stay with him quietly all his life. After the pain of being sick as a child, something much worse happened to him when he was a teenager. Martha Redford died in 1955 when Redford was only 18 years old. She had problems while giving birth. He was forever changed after losing a parent at such a young age. He often talked about her death as the most painful thing that happened to him as a child. At the age of 18, he had to deal with a steady sense of absence because of the loss. It also put him in situations with feelings and responsibilities that most young men his age were not ready to handle. People later noticed that he was very thoughtful because losing her made him serious, even when everyone saw him on screen as a golden boy. Redford's life at home in Venice, California got harder after his mother died. Having grown up in a working-class neighborhood, he often felt alone even though there were other people around him. He later said that as a young man, he liked being alone and thinking more than being with a lot of people. This feeling of being alone was a big part of his early life. It looked like a new and better time in his life was beginning when he married historian Lola Van Wagen in 1958. But tragedy struck again almost right away. They lost their first son, Scott, to SIDS when he was only 10 weeks old. Their loss was terrible, and Redford never really got over it in interviews, even though he rarely talked about it. He learned more about fragility and family life through the pain of losing Scott. It also made him more determined to keep what he held dear safe from prying eyes. Robert and Lola had 3 more children after that. Their names are Shauna, James, and Amy. He used their marriage as a base while building his business for many years. But the pain of loss came back decades later in a way that was just as heavy as the first deaths. His son James had a rare liver disease for a long time and needed 2 transplants just to stay alive. He had major health problems for most of his life. James made a name for himself as a filmmaker and activist, even though he was sick. He often worked on projects that showed how much he cared about the environment and social problems. Sad to say, James died at the age of 58 in 2020 from bile duct cancer, which was a result of his earlier health problems. Redford was 84 years old when it happened, and he said in public that it broke his heart. Even a strong man like Redford felt the weight of losing 2 children at different stages of their lives. Losing one kid is a grief that never goes away. But Redford had to deal with more than just these terrible events in his life. He had been married to Lola for almost 30 years, but in 1985 they split up. Redford never added to rumors about why they broke up because he didn't want his private life to be used for entertainment. That information wasn't for the public to see, and his silence on the subject supported the fact that he had always kept his personal life private. He lived alone for a long time before he met the German artist Sibylle Zegers and became friends with her. They got married in 2009. In his later years, he built a life with her around art, nature, and isolation. He was leaving the field that had shaped his success. Redford, unlike many famous people his age, didn't want to talk about his family life to get notice or sympathy from the public. He had seen too much death, and he knew that hiding that part of his life from the cameras was the best way to keep himself and the people closest to him safe. Redford was never a good fit for Hollywood. It was his style to do things his own way, and he never changed to fit in with the crowd. But while this made some people respect him, it also made things tense in some relationships. Hollywood versus Redford. People knew Robert Redford as one of the most famous stars in the world, but he was never really at ease in Hollywood. He was uncomfortable with the way the studio system worked from the start of his career and never held back from telling people how he felt. He talked a lot about how much he hated studio politics and how every project seemed to have to go through a lot of red tape. Many actors learned how to work within the system by keeping quiet or making deals with executives. Redford, on the other hand, often took the harder path and insisted on artistic freedom, even when it caused problems. The Great Gatsby, which came out in 1974, was one of the first and most well-known movies to do this. He was chosen to play Jay Gatsby. With a beloved book, an A-list cast, and a big company behind it, The movie had everything it needed to be a big hit. But Redford didn't like either the script or the choices that were made about who would play the parts. He told them he didn't like the way the movie was going and was angry about it. For him, not going to the opening was a big deal at the time, and a clear sign of how far he was willing to go to stand up for what he believed in. This attitude shaped a lot of his interactions with Hollywood. He often fought with directors over creative control, and he quit movies when he didn't think they were being handled in a way he could support. One time he allegedly quit a movie called Blue at the last minute, which made things very difficult for the studio. Even after being cast as the lead in a movie like Indecent Proposal, he almost quit because he didn't agree with how the story was being developed. Studio heads started to have trouble with Redford's image. He was easy to bank on and crowds loved him, but he wasn't always able to finish projects. His co-workers and Hollywood executives often told me about another habit of his that made them mad. People knew him for being late, or even not showing up to meetings at all. This could have hurt the careers of many actors, but Redford's talent, ability to draw crowds to the movies, and growing importance as a filmmaker and activist made him hard to ignore. He was able to take risks with his business because he had built up enough fame and power that people still wanted to work with him on projects, even though he wasn't always easy. Redford didn't think this was rebellion in and of itself, though. Actually, he didn't like how Hollywood put money and power over art. He also thought that producers needed a different place to work where they could set their own rules. Because of that view, he started the Sundance Institute and the Sundance Film Festival, which is one of the most important things he did for the business. Redford wanted Sundance to be a safe place for small film studios that were having a hard time breaking into a big studio-dominated business. He made it possible for young directors and writers to tell their own stories without having to change them to make money. You can't say enough good things about Sundance. A lot of directors, including Quentin Tarantino, Chloe Zhao, Ryan Coogler, and many more, got their start there and went on to have jobs that would change Hollywood. Redford saw Sundance as more than just a film festival. It was the exact opposite of how materialistic Hollywood was. It showed the kind of movies he liked, ones that let new voices and risky ideas shine instead of safe, predictable hits. Redford wasn't just independent in movies. He also spoke out about political and social problems at a time when many stars were afraid to do so for fear of losing fans. He used his fame to fight for environmental protection, Native American rights, and the rights of the LGBTQ community. These issues were often present in the projects he chose to back. Not only were movies like The Candidate and All the President's Men entertaining political dramas, but they also showed how he felt about questioning authority and holding strong institutions accountable. Redford did not see art and action as two separate things. They were linked. He used Hollywood's fame to bring attention to issues that were important to him. Of course, he wasn't always popular because he spoke his mind and didn't follow Hollywood norms. During his career, there were reports that he wouldn't work with some actors or directors again because of problems at home or at work. He never talked about these fights in public, which was true to who he was. It seemed to him that silence was stronger than fights. He had strong feelings about people he didn't agree with, but he didn't make those differences into news stories. People looked up to him and didn't know what he was thinking, which made him both admired and mysterious. But they knew what would happen if they didn't earn his trust after working together. Being independent and always going against what Hollywood norms said was what made him successful and what caused his relationships to break down the most. For every person who praised him for being himself, there were others who found him hard to get along with, unwilling to compromise, or even cocky. But Redford wasn't in the movie. His work life was the same as his personal life. He set clear limits and always stuck to his beliefs, no matter what. There were times when Redford had problems with professionals, but he never named names. In those cases, the problems were so public that they could not be ignored. One of them was about one of the most important screenwriters of the 20th century. Redford's early career was shaped by the words of this man. But the way things turned out for them showed that ego, control, and Hollywood politics could ruin even the best relationships. What went wrong with William Goldman? A lot of people talk about Robert Redford's work, without mentioning the part that screenwriter William Goldman played in making it what it is today. Goldman was one of the most famous writers in Hollywood. His plots shaped whole periods of movie history. The idea for Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid came from him. That movie gave Redford his big break and linked his name to Sundance forever. Goldman would go on to write a number of other hits, winning 2 Academy Awards for screenwriting in the process. He became known as one of the smartest and most important writers the business had ever seen. When Redford and Goldman first worked together, they seemed like the right pair. Goldman wrote clever lines of dialogue and a well-thought-out plot, and Redford brought star power, charisma, and a sharp sense of how to show people on screen. They made moments in film history together. Even though they were successful, they had artistic differences that led to one of the worst breaks in Redford's career. Everything came to a head while they were making All the President's Men in 1976, which was based on Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein's book about their probe into the Watergate scandal. Redford cared a lot about this project. He had bought the rights to the book himself. Both making the movie and acting in it as Woodward were things he did. He saw this as more than just another show. It had to do with power, truth, and news. That's why he cared so much about everything, from the actors to the writing. William Goldman was hired to write the script, and it looked like a great fit on paper. Goldman had just won an Oscar for his work on Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. He was known for making tough material into interesting drama. But as filming went on, Redford and director Alan Pakula became more and more annoyed by Goldman's drafts. They thought the script was too formal and didn't have enough of the raw investigative information that the story needed. After the fact, Redford said that he and Pakula changed a lot of the movie's script, keeping only about 10% of Goldman's original script whole. That thing Redford said in public hurt Goldman a lot. Hearing that his input had been cut down to almost nothing hurt a writer who took great pride in his work and had already done so much for Redford's career. Goldman claimed that even though changes were made, the film was still mainly his work, and he was mad that Redford would play his part so little. Even though things were tense, Goldman won the Oscar for Best Screenplay for All the President's Men. But the win wasn't easy. Behind the scenes, people in the business were wondering how much of the end movie really came from Goldman's writing. The Writers Guild of America looked into the situation and decided that Goldman should be given credit as the only author of the script, after looking over drafts and changes. It was an official admission that Goldman's work was still important to the movie, despite what Redford and Pakula had said. Goldman was hurt by what happened, and the wounds never fully healed. It seemed to him that Redford was trying to downplay his part in one of the most important projects of his career. He also thought that their once promising creative relationship had fallen apart because of ego and control. The two men never made up in public, and even though they worked together on other projects afterward, that was the end of their official relationship. Goldman, who had put his whole heart into the script, was angry for years, but Redford, who values loyalty and long-term relationships, seemed to be okay with the distance. Even now, a lot of fans remember the scene and wonder what might have happened if Redford and Goldman had been able to keep working together. They made Butch Cassidy and All the President's Men together. Could they have made more movies together that were as good? Or did the break have to happen because Redford was so determined to make his projects exactly how he wanted them? The truth is that Redford never talked about Goldman in depth after they broke up. Goldman himself carried his sadness in a quiet but strong way, which left the wound open. There are many broken relationships in Hollywood, but this one stood out because it involved two famous people who had once helped define each other's work. Because of their fight, Redford lost one of his most important creative partnerships, and it showed again how difficult his relationship with Hollywood was. There would be more fights between Redford and other big names in the business, though. Another actor with the same amount of power, impact, and unwavering pride as Redford would be William Goldman, who would be on the other side of his stubborn streak. Jack Nicholson versus Robert Redford. When two big names in Hollywood rise at the same time, it's almost natural that people will compare and compete with them. Jack Nicholson and Robert Redford were both born in the 1930s. Early in the 1970s, both became big stars, but they came to reflect very different sides of American film. With his blonde hair and good looks, Redford was the polished golden boy who was often played as the all-American hero. Nicholson, on the other hand, had a darker, more rebellious energy and made almost every part seem rough and unpredictable. Few people thought of them as friends, and while they never fought in public, people in Hollywood often talked about how they were quietly competing with each other. A few important events, mostly around The Great Gatsby, brought out the differences between the two guys. A lot of big names were considered for the lead part in The Great Gatsby when Paramount Pictures was making the movie in the early 1970s. The name Jack Nicholson was on the list. One of the most sought-after roles of the decade was that of Jay Gatsby, who was one of the most famous characters in literature. In the end, Robert Redford got the part. He was fresh off the hit of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. But Nicholson wasn't sure about the choice. Redford's image was said to be too clean, too wealthy, and too polished for him to play the haunted, ambitious driver that F. Scott Fitzgerald had made up in the book. He thought that Gatsby was a man who had scars from battle and desperation. Someone who became rich not because they were lucky, but because they were always keen to move up. Nicholson thought that he could make the role more real than Redford could. It was no secret that Nicholson didn't like Redford in the part. His later comment was that Redford seemed like a spoiled person, and he added that Gatsby would not worry about chopping his way up. Nicholson thought that Redford lacked the edge, the hunger, and the rough past that made Gatsby who he was. Not to put down Redford's skills, but to make a clear point about how differently the two men saw the same character. These things Nicholson said stuck with me. Redford had always been aware of how the press saw him, so he was careful about what he said and tried to avoid making things worse when they weren't necessary. On the other hand, Nicholson was more frank and didn't always use filters. There was a public record of their differences when Nicholson questioned Redford's fitness for Gatsby. This also added to the idea that the two actors didn't trust each other. Nicholson thought he could have given Gatsby more meaning, but he never got the chance to show it because he never played the part. But the idea kept coming up in Hollywood talks. Redford played the lead role in The Great Gatsby in 1974, but the movie did not do as well as the studio had planned. Different reviewers had different thoughts on the movie. Many of them said it was too shiny and didn't make them feel anything. It sounded like Nicholson knew exactly why the movie would fail based on what he said. Redford and Nicholson did play the same part more than once, not just in The Great Gatsby. It was thought that both of them might be able to play Michael Corleone in The Godfather. Al Pacino got the part in the end, and his dark intensity changed what people thought a crime story would be like. Another time was with The Sting in 1973, which is one of Redford's best-known movies. He was offered the part of Johnny Hooker, the young con artist who works with Paul Newman's character in the story. But Nicholson turned it down because he wanted to work on projects like Chinatown that he thought would be more difficult. Redford had one of the biggest hits of his career, and Nicholson gave one of the most acclaimed performances of the decade in Chinatown. There was good news for both men, but the overlap made it seem like they were working in the same area a lot of the time, picking from the same pool of well-known stories and judging each other, even if they didn't say it. Even so, Redford and Nicholson never worked together on a movie. It says a lot that these two stars aren't together. Hollywood often pairs stars who are competing with each other to make the movie more appealing to audiences or to build tension on screen. But this time, it didn't happen. Many ideas try to explain why. Some say that Nicholson didn't see any point in working with Redford, while others say that Redford liked to keep a tight grip on his projects and might not have wanted to share the attention with someone as strong-willed as Nicholson. Redford's friendship with Nicholson never turned hostile, unlike his fight with William Goldman. But the tension was clear in Nicholson's comments, the parts they both played, and the professional silence that kept them apart. For the audience, this rivalry stayed mostly behind the scenes, only being seen in quotes or what-if situations about roles they could have both played. Even so, it made Redford's situation with Hollywood even more complicated. He was a man who made people both admire and doubt him. He was good at what he did, but sometimes he was too careful, too controlled, and too polished. What do you think the problem was with the other actor? Leave a comment below and tell us. Remember to click on the next video on your screen if you like this one.